Horror is a genre submerged in shadow and obscurity, following the notion that the easiest way to terrify an audience isn't to shower them with blood, gore, or monsters, but to in fact restrict their exposure to these. For example, the Xenomorph, arguably the most iconic and terrifying monster design in cinema, has merely 4 minutes of screen time in Alien. In comparison, the far more action-oriented sequel Aliens, while still scary to a degree, strips the Xenomorph of the dark, claustrophobic, and mysterious atmosphere that so effectively surrounded it in Alien. The unknown has become the known. Thus, the scary monster or bloody death is either obscured or completely hidden in much of horror cinema, with sound often serving as the primary replacement for visuals. When bursts of violence do occur, they're short, abrupt, and succinct. So, with all that in mind, how does It Follows fundamentally disregard these techniques, but still retain that sense of foreboding and dread? Well, this subversion resides mainly in the unique premise and visual style of the film. The concept is quite simple. A supernatural entity attaches itself to people like a curse, following its victims relentlessly until their death. It can only be passed on to others through sexual intercourse, and only those who have or had the curse can see the entity. It doesn't run, it doesn't jump out and say boo, there's no tricks to it. It just walks towards you at a constant, slow pace. It doesn't matter how far you run or hide from it, it is always following you, and it will always find you. Unlike almost all other horror films, nothing in It Follows is ever really hidden from us. In fact, the very rules I decided are explained clearly to the protagonist, Jay.
It could look like someone you know, or it could be a stranger in a crowd. Whatever helps it get close to you.
Furthermore, the entity isn't hidden in typically spooky horror settings like a cabin in the woods, but in an ordinary suburban neighborhood in broad daylight. In fact, It Follows even lampoons the cabin in the woods trope by having the characters actually travel to one, only to lounge around as if on holiday. Instead, It Follows plays on the concept of inevitability. Here, it's more frightening knowing exactly how this thing will kill us, and that death is just constantly getting a little bit closer.
When there's torture, there's pain and wounds, physical agony, and all this distracts the mind from mental suffering so that one is tormented by the wounds until the moment of death. And the most terrible agony may not be in the wounds themselves, but in knowing for certain that within an hour, then within 10 minutes, then within half a minute, and now, at this very instant, your soul will leave your body and you will no longer be a person. And that this is certain. The worst thing is that it is certain.
To get existential for a moment, this is all an analogy for life. The inescapable fact that no matter what we do, how far we run, hide, or avoid the topic, death is always crawling a little closer at the same steady pace. But existential dread aside, It Follows uses some really unorthodox visual choices to complement its core premise. The eye is inherently drawn to certain elements in the cinematic frame like color, light, shape, or in this case, symmetry. Symmetry isn't normally associated with horror, besides maybe The Shining, though the use of symmetrical visuals in that film is probably more coincidental rather than intentional, considering it's a hallmark of Kubrick's visual style. In It Follows, symmetry draws additional attention to the supernatural entity, meaning that it's not only shown in broad daylight, but in the center of frame. While other horror films may use Dutch angles and off-kilter lighting in their framing to create a sense of unease, symmetry is almost always used to establish a sense of security and control. Besides Kubrick's aforementioned style, another example would be how in Paul Thomas Anderson's most recent film Inherent Vice, shots involving the drugged-out hippie protagonist Doc Sportello are framed and lit in a disorderly way, whereas shots involving the establishment look like something straight out of a Wes Anderson film. Yet, it's not only symmetry that works to an unnerving end, but the constant use of crossing the line. For the uninitiated, Satoshi Kon's Paprika has a fantastic scene explaining this.
It's an imaginary shooting line used to place subjects before the camera. Here, the camera mustn't cross over the line. If it does, then the cut can't be matched up. It's reversed. I'll give you a little demonstration. Watch. See what happens? You're facing the opposite direction.
Not only does it follows consistently cross the line, but it also uses 180-degree flips, meaning we cut from one shot to another that's 180 degrees reversed. To reference The Shining again, Kubrick intentionally used the technique in this scene for a jarring and discomforting effect. The same is applied here. Not only is this jump cut used like a quasi-jump scare in this scene, but it also imparts a sense of voyeurism, in which we become both the victim being followed and the persecutor following its victims. Thus, the dichotomy of followed and follower is introduced and explored throughout the film. There are even some shots that appear to establish a scene before it's revealed that they're actually from the perspective of the supernatural entity. Eventually, this builds into a rhythm. Followed, follower, followed, follower, followed, follower. Here we see Jay in the center of frame, in symmetry with the rest of the world, pursuing her victims and becoming the follower. And then there's the final shot of the film, where we finally step out from this voyeuristic perspective into a third-person point of view. While we now see the victim and persecutor in symmetry with each other, our time following these characters is over.